Welcome to Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C. I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to our program, The Liberty Alert, where every week we try to cut through the noise and take on the issues, especially the public issues that matter to people of faith, applying and relying on the wisdom of the Word for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. Or as we like to say at the LCRL, we're trying to put our temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of God for all. Yeah, just when I didn't think it could get any crazier here in Washington, D.C., this week it did. The leak, if you will, of the potential decision of the Dobb'S case took everybody by surprise, although it shouldn't surprise us because we see this action happen when certain groups don't get their way. We don't see law and order, that's for sure, and we don't see rule of law. We see things like leaking something that has never been leaked before. And so that's what was happening this week here on the Hill with the leaking of the potential decision of the Dobb'S case in favor of kicking Roe v. Wade back where it belongs into the legislatures and letting people vote or letting people elect people to vote their consciences concerning this very controversial issue. So let's just take a listen. I was there. I was outside of the Supreme Court. I think pretty much they organized some political rallies almost immediately. People are saying that this was meant to actually shore up the secular base, and I think there's a certain truth to that. And this was also meant to intimidate the justices, and that just cannot be. You know, when we start to threaten people for not ruling in a reasonable manner for the sake of all people, then I don't know how we're supposed to hold this all together with 330 million people. So again, one of the things before we get to the tape, one of the things that we talk about, we're not in D.C. to politicize anything. We're actually in D.C., the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. We are here to ensure that Caesar does his main role for all people, that he's a fair referee for all people. And so the big issues we deal with are religious liberty, because we defend it for all people, the sanctity of life, because we defend it for all people, especially the most vulnerable among us. And then even things like the institution of marriage and educational freedom, we fight for those as religious liberty issues. We're saying, look, you don't even have to agree, but we don't think the state should decide that for us. And so that's why we're here. And so listen to the sights and sounds now of the kind of discourse that now has been unleashed, because what we have now is basically a counter movement, a kind of a bullying movement to see if they can determine the outcome of the Dobb'S case. I'm here at the Supreme Court just checking out what's going on. They're doing campaign speeches right now about defending abortion completely. I think Elizabeth Warren just spoke. So we'll just try to listen in. A lot of sloganeering going on. It seems like a campaign rally, but I'm listening to see "My body, my choice" is kind of the chant. One group is saying abortion is oppression. The other one's saying abortion is health care. Not for the baby. So that was the first thing. When I was walking around, I was just trying to listen to the points that they were making, and I'm going to talk about that at the very end, about how basically all we hear now is euphemisms. We don't really actually hear what is it we're supposed to be deciding upon. I didn't hear anything about limiting this barbaric practice. All you heard about was, my body, my choice, that it's healthcare. Well, it's healthcare maybe for one group who says we don't want this baby alive, but it's actually a death sentence for the baby. And the question is, if that is a baby, which it is, that's science. You would hope that people would at least say when the baby's heart is beating, that they would actually start to feel some kind of sense of moral limitation on their actions. But you didn't get that in the screams and the kinds of sloganeering that was going on there. Remember back in the old days, they used to say we want abortion to be legal but rare. Well, that's no longer that's not in the air whatsoever. They want it legal and unlimited. They were disingenuous then, because they don't think anything of that life of that child. And there's 60 million children that have been aborted, and that should just give you pause. Now, what was interesting is I did run into one guy. There were some Christians in the middle praying, and they weren't very boisterous. There was one guy holding up a sign that I thought was really interesting. Let's listen in on that discussion. Can I ask you a question?
What's up?
You're saying give federalism a chance. Can you just tell me what you mean by that?
Abortion is not a federal issue. It should be decided by the states. So overturning Roe v. Wade will send it back to each state to decide for themselves whether or not it should be legal.
I think you're right.
There we go.
God bless you.
Nice talking with you.
The reason why I added that clip is just because, it was a very reasoned approach. In fact, that's all that will happen with the Roe v. Wade being overturned, is that it will become an issue that's decided by our elected representatives, which is exactly what it should have been in the first place. Because when people talk about how this is now federal law and it's settled law, that's just not true, because it was actually inserted into the Constitution in a way much like Dred Scott. It was just forced in there because there were certain forces and certain people who felt that it was time. And if the legislature wasn't going to do what they wanted, and it wasn't, the legislatures weren't. The states were very pro-life at that time. Just like the states were not overwhelmingly pro-slavery at the time of Dred Scott. And so this Supreme Court justice then and Supreme Court justices now decided to settle that discussion. Well, they don't have that right. In fact, the Founding Fathers said the only thing that could really lead to tyranny is if the judicial branch sides either with the executive branch and basically works in tandem with them, or with the legislative branch. And that's what's happening now. They're actually acting like a legislative branch. Well, when two of the three branches are doing kind of in concert with each other, your liberties are at risk. And that's why the Founding Fathers wanted the three branches of government, and they didn't want them to get along very well, because then we'd have to actually treat each other as neighbors, and we'd have to talk about these things, and we'd have to try to do what is right for everybody. So, it was really, when I talked to him, he said, yeah, that's what the issue really is about. So it's not the overturning, because there are states you can go to now that have much more expansive abortion rights than even Roe v. Wade protects. And that, again, like I said, about New York, about Maine, Massachusetts, California, you can virtually wipe out your child up to the day he's born or she's born. Or if you had anticipated that it was supposed to be an abortion, you can let them die outside of the womb. It's crazy. That's called infanticide. And yet we've even euphemized that as health care. The child is the innocent bystander, and the child is the innocent one, and the state's role in our life, if you want to talk about the basic role of the state, is to protect the weak against the strong, to protect the innocent against the guilty. And this is the only law, really, in the United States of America, where the weak persons are subject to the strong. And if they're not viable, if they're not even, that's that whole thing about viability. Viability is, we're not even going to define as whether you can fight back or not. We're just saying if you're not viable, like if you can't sustain yourself outside of the womb, then You have no right to live if they so decide. The state has never sided that way in any other legislation. And so again, it was good to run into someone who was reasoned that way. Now, what was also interesting was there were some people there talking about how this ruling is finally justice for the children. And they were saying justice for the 60 million children who have died silently. You had never heard their screams, but they were screaming. In fact, before I play this next clip, at the Rose Dinner, one of the gals that spoke this last time, it was a couple of times ago, she used to be an abortion provider, and she was dedicated. And then just one day it hit her as she was taking all the body parts of the child. You have to assemble them so to make sure that there's nothing left in the womb, because that could cause an infection. And she looked down and she realized that she was assembling body parts, and it hit her for the first time in her life what it was she was actually doing. And she said she could never do it again. So again, there was a group of people who these were pro-life people, and they were a little more boisterous in the sense that they were I don't know, I can't say they were shouting back, because they really were off to the corner. But let's hear their message. What was really interesting in that clip is they were talking about equality and justice, and they were talking about it for the sake of the children. And so that was a unique thing to hear amidst all the other things. And so a very heated debate, but it was really interesting at the end of that clip, and I know it's probably too soft to hear, but there was a group that started to gather around them to kind of push them out or intimidate them in return. And these group of girls said, "We love abortion." That was their response, and you probably didn't hear it. And so it was just it was bizarre that way, because it wasn't as big as I thought it was going to be, and it looked bigger on TV because they basically gated off everything, and they pushed us against this wall, so you couldn't even get from one side to the other. It was so tight. And so it gave the impression that there were more people there. But again, I tried to go walk around and hear all the different things that were being said all throughout the protest, and just try to gauge. It was an obviously angry protest, and there were several pro-abortion people speaking, and so to that degree, it almost seemed like a campaign rally rather than like a organic response type of thing. And I've seen that all too often here on the Hill. So what should we say? What should we say towards all of this? And well, first of all, the fact that it was leaked, that's got to be dealt with. I mean, because we cannot continue to have one group of people just defy the law. And we saw that happen leading up to last election, where people were breaking the law all over the place and threatening and intimidating. We saw that here in D.C., and virtually there was absolutely no response. There was no punishment. There was no holding anybody accountable. If this continues, and this even happened with gay marriage, because if you remember the history of that, in 2008, the state of California actually voted to protect marriage. And again, you probably don't know this because it wasn't reported much, but 75% of African Americans and 75% of Hispanic Americans voted for the defense of marriage. And they were disenfranchised. By whom? By liberal white people and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then what happened was, I think it was Newsom, whoever was the mayor of San Francisco, started to disobey the law and just started to marry same-sex couples, and that's how it finally pushed its way all the way to the Supreme Court. So when the law is something they don't like, they defy it, and then when it is something that they finally get through, they demand that we all respect it. Well, it has to be both ways for everybody, and it has to be equal protection under the law. So where do we go from here? And the answer is, first of all, I think Roe v. Wade should be overturned. It's bad law. It's not in the Constitution. You know, I always tell people, I said, prohibition wasn't in the Constitution either, and there's an amendment process, and people felt so strongly about prohibition, they amended the Constitution. That's the process. If it's not in there, you don't have the right to just put it in there, and 9 judges don't have the right to rule us. They're not elected officials. They're supposed to do and apply what the law demands. And constitutional law limits even that to certain things. Even our legislators cannot just invoke any kind of law. If it defies the Constitution, then it is struck down, and that's their job. If it's in the Constitution, they protect. If it's not in the Constitution, they rule that it's not in the Constitution. Well, there have been a couple of bad cases down through history where they ruled on something that wasn't in there, and there were terrible consequences. And we're seeing the same thing with Roe v. Wade. They just invented it out of whole cloth. And from that point on, it has divided the country in ways that you can't even imagine, because it took away our representatives' right to act on our behalf. So what should we do? These campaign rallies, we still got to get to the heart of what we're talking about. And that means you have to start by asking, what is it we're talking about? What is abortion? Clearly define it. Get over these euphemisms. It's not a termination of a pregnancy. It's the killing of an innocent life. And the viability question is one that's on display, and it goes to that's the only reasoned response to those who say, why is this legal? Well, because that life isn't viable yet. And that's why you have all these laws of viability saying, okay, well, if we're drawing a clear line of viability, let's do it at 15 weeks or 12 weeks or when the heart beats, and then nothing after that. Well, none of those are acceptable to these kind of radical secularists. They demand all the way to the end of the 9th month, and that's what's crazy. So what is it we're talking about? The right to kill a vulnerable human being. And so we should have reasoned dialogue about that. And what I heard, about even like my body, my choice, well, that's fine, except there's another body now, and it's called the infant in your womb, the infant child. They already have an autonomy. They have separate DNA. They are domicile. They are not they're not like an appendix. They're within the body of a mother. That's just the way we were made. Don't you think it's interesting that I think they're probably going to have huge protests this weekend? And what is this weekend? Mother's Day. Wow. I mean, that's when you start to realize, my goodness, they don't even see the irony. Whoever leaked this did not see the irony of leaking it the week of Mother's Day. And maybe that's because, as far as they're concerned, they've already gutted the notion of motherhood, because now there are places that are calling them birthing people now. The uniqueness of a mother, that's what we celebrate on Mother's Day. And then we're supposed to try to celebrate what the uniqueness of a father is on Father's Day. But let's get clear about it. I think that's the first thing that we have to do when we engage these issues. We have to be clear about what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is the state's power to grant people the right to take the life of an innocent human being just because they don't wish it. And please don't do the rape and incest thing here, because I don't know what the number is, 97, 98, 99% of abortions are convenience, purely for convenience. And that was also the thing they said at the that abortion was not contraception, and now that's basically what it is. Okay. And so there is a response to this. And the first thing is we have to be clear about what we're talking about. And that's why when you read, there's an article in Town Hall this week where Nancy Pelosi defended, she actually started to say, I'm a faithful Catholic, she said over and over and over again. And I'm telling you that we're backtracking on women's rights. And I'm saying, well, there's a lot of women who don't agree with you, Nancy. So don't use that word generically. But then right away, she led under her House leadership, and you better watch this. It's called the Women's Health Protection Act, and basically what it is to codify abortion as a national law, irrespective of state laws again. So that's what it's about. When they use these euphemistic things, Women's Health Protection Act, abortion is not a health care issue for women. It is a termination of the baby's life issue for women. And whatever you want to call that, it's not health care. In fact, very often Planned Parenthood doesn't provide hardly any health care in terms of that. It just provides the abortion services. And that's why she used the euphemistic term, a person's constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy. If you can find that in the Constitution, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually realized that Roe v. Wade was on very shaky legal ground, that it had created a right out of thin air. And they've been trying to do these mental legal hoops just to keep it viable. Well, the Dobb'S case is now going right to the heart of the viability issue. And I think that's where it's going to finally be rightfully litigated as something that it's not a constitutional issue. It is something that is a legislative issue. And so our man who said it's not a federal issue, he was right. He was right. And he was just standing right there in the middle trying to give some people something to think about. So I love at the end of this article, it said it's time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. And there was another article I read by Charles Cook, and he was talking about how Roe v. Wade has always been legally suspect. In fact, he said utter nonsense, because deep down we all know it is. There is no right to terminate a child's life in the Constitution. I mean, if there's a right to terminate a person's life in the Constitution, then what's the point of the Constitution whatsoever? And he actually quotes a pro-choice legal scholar, John Hart Eli. And this was, I guess this guy wrote right after Roe was handed down. He wrote that Roe created a super protected right that is not inferable from the language of the Constitution, the framers' thinking respecting the specific problem and issue, any general value derivable from the positions they included, or the nation's governmental structure. And then he said, it's a question the Constitution has not made the court's business. Roe is bad law. Wow. And so, you can say the word democracy all you want. Roe is actually an anti-democratic ruling. It was very much a monarchical ruling by 9 justices. Well, not all 9. So again, right from the very word go, it's not about what do you think of the Texas law, what do you think of the Dobb'S law, what do you think of these laws. It's about the fact that Roe is bad constitutional law. And so even when you start to quote somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now you know that she saw the legal. I mean, she agreed with abortion. She's obviously an abortion supporter, what she was when she was on the court. But Roe was not the law to codify that, as far as she was concerned. And so again, when we start to talk about these things, and that's why I said when I listened to the chants, I was trying to come up with, well, what's their reason for saying what they're saying? My body, my choice. Well, yes, and that's one of the reasons why some people were arguing COVID. You don't have the right to put something in my body that I don't consent to. Well, they threw that out the window. But what does that have to do with the fact that you're saying my body, my choice, and now I can take the life of that child who has their own body? And if they had the power, would have their own choice. Abortion is health care. Again, how so? Ask them how. Why? Well, the termination of pregnancy means that I don't have to raise that child. So how is that health care? So again, it's raw power is what abortion is. And so as we talk about these things, I'm reminded about how Pope John Paul II dealt with these things, and he talked about this in an encyclical letter called Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. And one of the first things he said was, we have to reject euphemisms in how we discuss this action, which is the killing of an unborn child. So we don't call it the interruption of a pregnancy. That's not what it is. It's a doctor literally burning a child to death or dismembering a child to death within the womb of a mother. So let's talk about it as it is. And so he said, no more euphemisms. So don't call it a fetus. Call it what it is. It's an unborn child, not termination of pregnancy, and start to. And it's not pro-choice, and all those kinds of things. Because now we're not talking about what the thing we're actually supposed to be talking about. And so he said very clearly, it's the deliberate and direct killing by whatever means it is carried out of a human being. And then he went on to talk about the moral gravity. If we don't deal with this, there is a sense where then what kind of people are we? So we're a people of life, and I think that's what was. When we came to Washington D.C., we're fighting for the sanctity of life because your life is precious. Even if you disagree with us on these issues, your life is still precious, and we cannot let the fundamental principle of the sanctity of life be diminished, because once you come up with the term "a life not worth living," then human beings, sinful human beings, can do heinous things to one another. That's one of the things that the West has tried to fight for, is this notion that all life is sacred. That we haven't always lived up to that principle. There's no doubt that that's true, but the principle is true. And so you don't disregard the principle just because a culture hasn't always lived up to it. It's still the one culture, in the Western culture, still the one culture that has demanded this of itself and literally tried to rise to those things in spite of its own sins. So, you think about this and you think all this stuff through. The sanctity of life is something we should fight for all people, and that includes even those with whom we disagree. And even the notion that a person's life has inherent dignity, and especially those who are the weakest among us or the vulnerable among us. And in this case, as I said before again, the weak were left vulnerable by the power of the state. And that should never be. So it was quite a week. We're glad that we are here. As I said before, the Dobb'S case is finally hitting at the heart of what this is all about, and we'll see what God has in store for us.
Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.